Hello to those that are joining us. Welcome. We're just going to allow another minute or so to allow others to join. In the meantime, if you would like to, write in the chat box if there's anything in particular that you're doing around gender bonds and you want to share, and it's something that we might be able to come back to during the Q&A, then feel free to write your name, your organisation, and something about what you're up to. We'll just wait a few more seconds.
What a fantastic group of people. It's just so great to watch the list of people who are coming on, and excited to hear what questions and ideas people have to share. Hi, Andia. It's great when people put in where they're calling in from, and I think it'd be great to hear if anybody is working on anything around gender bonds and wants to be visible around that, if you might put that in the chat window.
So we're just going to give maybe another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll make a start. So hello from Lisa Thomas, Suzanne. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. Hi, Natasha. Great to see you could join us.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we should make a start, and hopefully people will continue to join us. So yes, let's get going. So my name's Juliette Munro, and I'm a director at FSD Africa. And on behalf of FSD Africa and our partners, which are UN Women and Lions Head Group, I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome to this 1-hour webinar on the viability of gender bonds in sub-Saharan Africa, which is based on the report that we have recently published and that hopefully a number of you have already seen and have read. We've had an overwhelming response from people wishing to attend this webinar, so it's clearly a hot topic, which is incredibly encouraging, and we look forward to having discussion on that. We've got representation from across Africa, including Europe, the US, and Asia on this call, and covering the development community, the public and private sector investment world, the research and advisory community, and much more. So we're going to be recording this session, so you can recap later and or share with any other colleagues that aren't able to join this call. Just before we start, I just want to quickly go over the agenda. So we're just going to start with some introductions from our key partners from UN Women and from FSD Africa. And then we're going to have a presentation of the key finding highlights by Lions Head Group. Before I hand over to our colleague Suzanne at Catalyst at Large to give some brief reflections on the findings before we open up to Q&A. And then we'll finish off with some final closing remarks from FSD Africa. So that's really the agenda. If we look at our panelists today, we've got a very esteemed panel. I'm going to start by introducing two members of the panel that will give brief introductory remarks. So Gaia, if you could put the panel slide up, that would be great. First and foremost, we're very honoured to have Ms. Anita Bhatia, to join us, who's the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director for Resource Management, UN System Coordination, Sustainability and Partnerships at UN Women. Prior to joining the UN, Ms. Batia served as Director of Global Partnerships for the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, where she developed and expanded innovative partnerships with public and private sector partners. Throughout her distinguished career, she has focused on enhancing sustainability, institutional effectiveness, and impact through strategic partnerships. So you're very welcome, Anita, and we look forward to your remarks. But before I just hand over, I'd like to also introduce my colleague, Evan Zassano, who's also going to be giving some initial remarks. He's the Director of Capital Markets at FSD Africa. He's leading on all our capital market development initiatives across the continent. These include green bond markets and market infrastructure development, as well as now gender bonds. Evans has got over 20 years of experience in investments, financial markets and development finance, spanning the continent as well as the Middle East and North Africa region, North America, Europe and Asia. Prior to joining FSD Africa, Evans worked for the IFC and World Bank Group as Head of Efficient Securities Market Institutional Development in Africa. And at the World Bank Group, he participated in FSAP's financial sector assessment programs and provided technical assistance and debt and equity capital markets and institutional investors in diverse regions. So he's worked with many organisations. So welcome both of you. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Ms. Anita Batia to give some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Juliet. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this morning. And I have to say, it is really an extraordinarily good time to be having this very important conversation. And it's a real pleasure for me as the ASG and as the Deputy Executive Director of UN Women to be able to provide some opening remarks on gender bonds and their feasibility in sub-Saharan Africa today. I'll tell you why excuse me, why I think this moment is particularly opportune. First and foremost, we're now 6 months into the pandemic, and I think we can see very clearly that it has had what we have described as a disproportionately negative impact on women. And from where we sit and from the data that we have been able to collect over the last few months, it's very clear that for our mandate, which is to secure gender equality and women's empowerment globally, that actually there has been a big step back and a big pushback. And actually we run the risk right now of having years of progress undermined, not just because the last 25 years haven't seen adequate response and adequate progress in many areas of the gender equality agenda, but because the pandemic itself has had a particularly crushing impact on 3 areas that relate to women's welfare in particular. And those have to do with income, with health, and with security. I think all of you have been following what is happening with women's employment, with women's access to educational as well as economic opportunity. So I don't need to go into details and paint for you just how stark the picture is. What I do want to share with you, however, is that the reason that we are all here today, which is to discuss how do we use our imaginations and our collective capacities to create new innovative financing instruments that can help drag women out of this situation into situations of better welfare is really key right now. And so the United Nations has been issuing a series of policy briefs where we lay out what we are seeing from our global access worldwide. And so when we look at what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we are very concerned that a very large number of women are going to fall back into poverty. In fact, we estimate that 47 million women will fall back into poverty worldwide just in the space of 1 year. Now, what does this have to do with gender bonds, you might ask? And I'll tell you what it does. First and foremost, governments we know worldwide are struggling to create the financial and the fiscal space to be able to respond to the crisis. And the response has been pretty amazing in its scale and scope. One estimate is that when you add up all of the lending that has taken place by the multilateral system, and if you count all the money that is swishing around in the system right now, it's as much as $11 trillion and counting. And that money is money for fiscal stimulus packages going mainly towards social safety nets and towards investments in public health systems. However, there is a need actually for even more funding. And we know that there is a need for innovative financing schemes that will match the supply and the demand. And the demand is there because governments are simply not able to borrow enough from the multilateral institutions, partly because for the fund, if you borrow as a country, you have to pay back in 5 years. And those countries in Africa which do have access, and most of them do, to the soft concessional lending arm of the World Bank Group, which is IDA, are already at the limits of what they can borrow. So there is really not much space for more official borrowing. So then you have to ask, well, then what can be done to leverage the private sector, and what can be done to tap institutional investors and pension funds who are sitting on probably $80 trillion of assets and are looking for investments that are going to give them both a commercial return and a social return. And that's where gender bonds have a really important role to play. So UN Women has been engaged in thinking about gender bonds for some time now, as is evidenced by our leadership and co-sponsorship of this study. But in addition to that, we have actually begun a series of dialogues with governments in the region to explore how at this particular juncture we can bring together the interest of institutional investors and pension funds, both domestic and foreign, as well as the very real needs on the ground to perhaps launch gender bonds in 1 or 2 countries where country circumstances and capacities are aligned with the need. And since we are already in dialogue with a number of governments, we are already discovering that this is something, A, that is not only possible, but actually desirable, B, that it could be a way to direct large resources to solving for some of the gender equality issues that we are seeing. And because it is something that would allow us to very quickly, if we're able to pull this off, mobilize resources, we could really give a running start to restarting the gender equality agenda in many countries. So this is something that has the potential to have profound impact. It comes at a very good time. Yesterday was the high-level meeting on financing for development, which is co-led by the governments of Jamaica and Canada. And this is a process that the Secretary General of the UN himself is leading. And it is a process designed to feed into a number of other key moments in the rest of the year, including the Bretton Woods meetings in October, as well as the G20 and the G7 meetings. And then tomorrow, there is at the UN in New York, though virtually this time, the global meeting on the Beijing platform, where we will look at progress country by country over the last 25 years on the key elements of the gender equality agenda. So I really want to congratulate the organizers and everybody who's contributed to this effort, because the timing really couldn't be better and the ambition is fantastic, and the outcomes, if we can all collectively work on this, will be consequential for gender equality in Africa. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anita, for those excellent remarks. And we're grateful to have partnered with you, and we look forward to continuing with you in the future. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to now hand over to Evan Zassano to say a couple of words on behalf of FSD Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Juliet, and thank you, Anita. And on behalf of the organizers, the partners, UN Women, Alliance Head partners, I also wish to take this opportunity to warmly welcome the participants to this webinar. I can see we have 160 participants at the moment, and I can see potential issuers of gender bonds here represented in the webinar. I can see investors, I can see regulators, some of them known to me for many years, who are going to approve the gender bonds. I can see investment banks that are going to structure the gender bonds in the continent. And I can also see quite a number of potential beneficiaries as well. So it's great to be connected as part of this webinar in building the market. And I feel particularly honored that I'm a minority today, but I'm hoping that that will change over time. So just a few words of introduction. First of all, FSD Africa, for many of you who may not know, is a specialized development agency that is funded by FCDO. We focus on supporting the financial sector in Africa so that we can be able to finance and develop or address the poverty issues in the continent. So we work on a number of areas. So we provide expertise. We also provide the financing to be able to support the agenda across the continent. And then one other thing I wanted to mention is that across all our programming, we focus on increasing gender equality. So this gender bonds agenda is actually very important for us. It fits very much squarely in our mandate. So across our programming in capital markets, we are working now in 28 countries, over 20 initiatives, working with a number of regulators, about 10 of them across the continent, to improve their regulatory capacity. We are building market infrastructure. We are also developing new programs, as Juliet mentioned, green bonds, gender bonds, new products in the market. And we are very much focused on providing demonstration. So we hope that after this webinar, we'll be able to go to the next stage of having actual demonstrations in the market. So why are gender bonds important for us? A number of reasons. The first one is about increasing financial inclusion for very important segments of our society that are also very productive. The second agenda, which is very important, is about economic empowerment for women in the continent, to improve incomes, obviously, to create more jobs, to provide access to basic services, and to secure a more sustainable future for all of us. So that's why this agenda is very important. This particular study is groundbreaking in many ways. It's the first study that has been undertaken, but we do hope that we'll move beyond the study to actually seeing transactions in the market. What we have seen is the market is, from the studies, that is a very small market, probably $2 billion of issuances outstanding. So it's a nascent market. So we, as the practitioners in Africa, have the opportunity to help in building these markets, having more issuances in the market, and of course, addressing the issues of standards that have been highlighted in the study. The issuers that we have seen so far, the profile are mostly in the financial institutions, but we hope that corporates will also join in. And I am very personally passionate about seeing sovereign gender bonds coming to the market, because we need to move huge sums of money to be able to address the challenges that are faced by our fellow women as well, and the girls as well. So we are very excited to be part of this program, and we are hoping that together, working with all the stakeholders who have joined us, and others will get the opportunity to learn more about this work, to work together and to coalesce and develop this market for the benefit of our people in Africa. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Evans. That was a great intro. So thank you to both of you for that. So now we're going to move on with our core agenda item, which is the presentation of the research highlights. And for this, I'd like to invite and welcome three people, one of which is Gaia de Baptista, who's going to lead the presentation. Gaia works for Lion's Head Sustainable Advisory Practice, working and advising clients to implement solutions which support sustainable development and a transition to low carbon economy. Through her work, Gaia has touched on a range of sectors and also a range of products. This study was her first foray into the gender lens investing world and has been incredibly helpful. Gaia is going to be supported in the Q&A by Rebecca Calder, who was very much involved in the research in an advisory capacity. Rebecca is a gender and social inclusion specialist and a director and co-founder of Core Global. She has nearly 30 years of policy and field experience in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, leading various research, capacity building, and project implementation activities. So we look forward to hearing from Rebecca. And after the presentation, I'm going to also invite Suzanne Beagle to provide some reflections I think many of you probably know Suzanne. She's a founder of Catalyst at Large and co-producer of the Global Gender Smart Investing Summit. She's globally recognized expert on gender smart investing with her extensive work, which would take too long to describe, having influenced hundreds of funds and institutional investors and literally billions of dollars of capital to move with the gender lens. So before I hand over to Gaia, just to say, as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, then please do feel free to post them in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer them, and we may have time to pick out one or two during the discussion. I see that some of you have already mentioned things on chat, which is great. So yes, please feel free to note a few things down. In the meantime, Gaia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Hi. So let's kick off with the highlights of the report. So firstly, thank you to UN Women and FSD Africa for the opportunity to work on such an interesting topic. But now, the title of the study is about sub-Saharan Africa, but the study itself really started from a global review of gender bonds, how these are defined, and what the current state of the market is. So we will talk through all of these topics before circling back on sub-Saharan Africa and the potential there, and finally touching on the ever-present COVID-19. So starting off with the basics. So what is a gender bond? So a gender bond is a debt instrument where the proceeds are used to advance women's equality and empowerment, and falls more broadly in line with green bonds and social bonds, which are known as use of proceeds bonds. So use of proceeds bonds are bonds where the proceeds are ring-fenced for a specified use. But these don't necessarily need to be any different to other bonds from a credit or credit risk exposure perspective. At the moment, however, there is no universal definition of a gender bond or of the activities that we deem as eligible for this type of instrument. And so the way that we classify and describe gender bonds in this report is primarily based on precedent. So the bonds that have been issued and labeled as gender to date. Unlike the social and green bonds, gender bonds don't have their own specific guidelines or principles, but they do fall and are recognized to fall under the social bonds category. So a number of gender bonds issued to date have actually referenced the social bond principles as their guiding standards. So how big is this market and who is issuing gender bonds? To date, there have been about $2 billion of labeled gender bonds. And if we include the DFI and MDB bond programs, which have broader SDG labels associated with them, this actually goes up to over 3 billion. But in this study, we really focused on the labeled issuances. As you can see, the issuers are spread out all over the world. But these are really primarily financial institutions that are doing this. And in one case, another large corporate. A number of the gender bonds listed here were actually issued with support from DFIs, MDBs, or other aid agencies who provided either anchor investment, technical assistance, or credit enhancement, though not all of these bonds received that kind of support, which is encouraging for the corporate and commercial space as well. So what are gender bonds being used for? It's very well saying women's empowerment and equality, but what does that mean? So if we look at the bonds that have been issued to date, the use of proceeds has been primarily split into two broad categories. One of them is what we're calling corporate behavior bonds, and the other is financial inclusion bonds. Corporate behavior bonds are bonds where the proceeds are on-lent to companies that essentially score well on their internal gender actions and policies. So for example, lending to a company where there are more than 50% women on their board, and they have, for example, great parental leave policy and other relevant internal policies which impact women directly. The way these work is a little bit like ESG has worked more broadly, and particularly in the equity space. So they reward companies that behave in a way that is equitable and beneficial to women in their workforce. These make up most of the market today by amount issued, though not by number of bonds, and have been issued primarily in Australia and Canada. Financial inclusion gender bonds, on the other hand, are very different, and they have been primarily issued in emerging economies and are focused on women's financial inclusion through lending, through microfinance institutions and SME lending to women-owned enterprises. Now, these two types of bonds end up impacting very different groups of women. In the first, it is very much women in corporate settings, and these to date have tended to be in more developed markets. But to be clear, there's no reason why this couldn't be done in a developing market by a large corporate. Whereas in the second case, the financial inclusion bonds issued to date have been primarily benefiting women in low income settings in developing markets. Now, I think it's really important to point out that both of these uses of proceeds, these categories, are really relevant to women's empowerment. So we should keep that in mind as we explore how these bonds can be used. Now, there has been a little bit of issuance, and you'll see that on the slide, it's very small, a little bit of issuance where the proceeds have gone to companies that offer goods and services for women and that disproportionately benefit women. But this has been a very small percentage of the market today. So what else and what more can gender bonds do? Where do we go next with gender bonds? So I think the first thing to point out is that the market is still really small. So there is no use of proceeds or segment or topic that has been exhausted and can't possibly absorb any more capital. But if we look down the list of things that gender bonds could potentially finance, there are some which have not yet received as much attention in the bonds issued to date. And one of these uses is what I was mentioning earlier. So financing for companies that provide goods and services which disproportionately benefit women. And we will touch on what that could mean in a second. Another, which is very topical today, in part due to COVID and the focus that that's put on supply chain fragility, is encouraging corporates in embracing the equitable inclusion of women in their supply chain and formalizing women's input in the supply chains. That's on the use of proceeds side, but there is also more which can be done from a structure perspective as well. For example, we're increasingly seeing debt play in a role that's traditionally been held by equities, really, which is pushing for change within companies. In the environmental space, we've seen this in sustainability-linked bonds, where the coupon is dependent on the coupon paid by the issuer is dependent on them meeting a certain set of KPIs. So they have to hit particular targets that have been predefined and shared with investors. And if they don't hit them, the coupon, for example, could increase. So there's a real cost to that company in not hitting these targets. Gender bonds could conceivably use a mechanism like this to drive transformation around gender in corporates, as well as rewarding those that are already doing really well. Likewise, there are a number of activities which actually maybe don't really fit private investment or don't really work with corporate expenditure. And so perhaps, and this was mentioned earlier in the opening remarks, we can see a government gender bond come to market to address some of these issues, which are softer and not appropriate for say, a financial institution to address more broadly. Overall, however, the market as a whole absolutely needs to grow, and more capital needs to flow to gender-aligned activities and companies. So how do we get this capital to flow? How do we grow this market? So to grow, we believe the market really needs clear standards and transparency. As we said earlier, there are no specific standards for gender bonds. So if we look at the cohort of bonds that have been issued today, there's really quite a variety of standards and references that are made. And currently these four listed here, so the social bond principles, the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, SDG 5 itself, and the 2X challenge criteria are the main ones that are being used. And whilst all of these are valid and bring something to the table, they tend to offer slightly different things. So the social bond principles, for example, isn't particularly specific when you go and look at, okay, well, what qualifies for a gender bond? But it does provide very good holistic guidance on how a bond should be issued, what is required of the issuer in terms of reporting, for example, and managing of proceeds and so on. On the other hand, if we look at the 2X challenge, the Women's Empowerment Principles, and SDG 5, they may not offer the specific bond issuance guidance, but they do each offer greater specificity on the gender aspect of that bond. So whether that's from an outcome perspective, so what kind of outcome are you looking for women beneficiaries, or from an eligibility criteria perspective, so what kind of criteria do you need to meet in order to call this a gender bond, these offer more of that. And a way to highlight that right now is that, for example, if we think about the uses of proceeds, it's not immediately clear necessarily to a potential issuer or a potential investor what is within the realm of eligibility for a gender bond. So for example, lending to a company producing affordable menstrual health products targeting lower income communities could perhaps intuitively fit within that scope, but it's hard to say where that line is between different activities and different businesses. What about affordable childcare services? Because childcare typically falls to women, should that fall under this category? I think as soon as you start asking these questions, it becomes really clear that these are not trivial questions, and there is a need for clarity and guidance. So having harmonized reference standards which capture both the eligible uses of proceeds, so what can you finance and call a gender bond, and the issuance requirements to issue that bond, we think is key to opening up this market, because standards give investors assurance that the bond is aligned with best practices, that a level of quality has been met without them needing to become gender experts from day one. And on the other side, it gives issuers greater clarity on whether this is a field they can play in, right? Whether they can participate in this. So this really enables capital to flow by enabling both sides of the market to participate more fully, and eventually, ideally, dedicated pools of capital to form around this theme, just like we're seeing green bond funds at the moment. So on to sub-Saharan Africa. Can gender bonds be issued in SSA? So the short answer here is absolutely, but there is a slightly longer answer. So there are three key ingredients to issue a gender bond, and it's a willing issuer, a credible use of proceeds, which is, as we said, non-trivial, and an interested investor. So when trying to answer this question, originally we took 3 sample countries from sub-Saharan Africa and looked at them a little bit more closely. And some of the things we looked at within these countries was whether they had a relatively developed debt capital market that was also quite active, if there had been a precedent for thematic issuance and thematic investors, so whether that's green or social. And lastly, whether there has been any gender lens investing done before within that market. And now, each one of the markets we looked at had a specific context to themselves. So for example, in Nigeria, there's actually quite a strong gender lens investing sector, but this is primarily in the private markets, not in the listed space. In Kenya, where there is a wealth of financial inclusion and innovation, there's a strong pipeline, but at the moment, the debt capital markets are a little bit dislocated, and so there's a potential mismatch of expectations around, for example, risk and pricing between local institutional investors and potential issuers. And then in South Africa, we found actually, particularly with some investors, this topic, institutional investors, this topic resonated very strongly. And there was a little bit of pipeline available within the financial institutions. So every country is different and every market context is different. And this is not to say that other countries, which we didn't look into as closely, couldn't issue. We absolutely think the 3 key ingredients are the key ingredients. But what we found is that there is one theme which runs through all of these, which is that institutional investors do tend to be quite conservative across sub-Saharan Africa. And we have yet to see sort of large funds coming together with a theme, so large pools of capital that are thematic. But that's not to say that this is a significant hurdle. I think this is something that can be overcome, and there are different ways of doing it. So if you're operating in a market where the local institutional investors are really restricted to sort of senior unsecured blue chip debt, then the best way perhaps to grow the gender bond market in that country, in that market, is to start with a blue chip issuer who is going to issue a senior unsecured bond, which is then the proceeds of which are then used for eligible gender activities. Conversely, there's also a lot of engagement with investors, which needs to happen to make sure that they're comfortable with the structure being put forward. And then lastly, absolutely, if there is a need for concessional support or technical assistance support, and there is capital and capacity available from the DFIs or other institutions, then that's something that should be leveraged where possible and necessary. But overall, we think there is a very strong potential across the continent for this, and we would love to see conversation and action come out of this. And then onwards, finally, to COVID-19, because we haven't heard enough about COVID-19 yet. This has been mentioned earlier and very well earlier on in the opening remarks, but we all know that women have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, not by the illness itself, but by corollary activities and impacts, whether that's by virtue of the sectors that women are primarily involved in, or things like unpaid care work during lockdown, or women's health, or even in sub-Saharan Africa. One thing that's very important is the informal sector, and the fact that the informal sector has a significant portion, women are a significant part of the informal sector, so they may not benefit from recovery packages as much. So we do think gender bonds can be used for the recovery effort, whether by governments or by corporates to maintain their workforce whilst we get back to some semblance of normality. But also we think they can be used for future resilience. So the inclusion, the formal and equitable inclusion of women and women-owned SMEs in the supply chains. That's very, very important. I think COVID has really highlighted the importance of this. Job security and decent working conditions, corporate policies, the care burden, flexible working hours, things like this. I think this is a good time to explore the potential of these instruments for the longer term. With that, I just wanted to thank you all for your attention. And we hope that this presentation has provided a good overview of the gender bond market and that it will catalyze further discussion, but most importantly, action and investment in this space. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gaia, for your very concise and thought-provoking presentation. And of course, there's the full report to refer back to. As I mentioned at the beginning, before I open it to the floor, I'd like to invite Suzanne Beagle to spend a couple of minutes giving her reflections on the findings. And she'll then pose a couple of questions to all of us as we lead into the Q&A to provoke some discussion. And also we see a lot of questions coming up through the chat and the Q&A functions. So Suzanne, based on your extensive experience, what are your key takeaways from the findings? And what calls to action do you think they identify that we need to do something about as an investment and a development community?
Thank you, Juliet. And I want to say, I'm looking at the list of people that are on this call, and one of my observations is we have everything we need with the people that are on this call and the people they're connected to make this happen. To start to make progress. So just very excited to see who's here. And I found the briefing really clear and cogent and timely and relevant, and especially the opening remarks by Anita and Evan. So a couple of things. We heard about standards, confidence, and capital, and I want to add a few C's. I want to talk about collaboration, which we've been talking about, the roles that the different actors on this call and in the report can play, from public sector actors, the private sector actors, the DFIs, the banks, the corporates, the financial structuring intermediaries, the people in the foundation space, the individual investors, the people in the regulatory frame, and the people who can both tee it up and fund and support the R&D, and then the overhead of getting these off the ground until we have a flywheel where these are just a regular thing in the market, as happened in green bonds and is happening in blue bonds. So for people to really see from their perspective where they fit. So collaboration, commitment, and that it's going to take commitment to really bring these things forward. And so who can really get behind the commitment side? Collaboration, commitment, and courage, because this isn't easy work. But at this moment, people said, well, there's no such thing as a green bond. And now we have a market of, I don't know, $188 billion of green bonds that happened last year in the market, compared to $1 billion in gender bonds. Courage, and then capacity building. We talked about the need to really do capacity building for the investors to understand what these structures are, what they're good for and what they're not good for. We should be really thinking about expanding the power of people's imagination, as we heard across the whole past hour, and really helping people understand, again, from where they sit, what's the role that they can play, how do we do this? I think people have a good perspective on the why. I'm really appreciative of the expansion from the corporate behavior bonds to backing women SMEs, which is absolutely essential. We have trillions of dollars of need and demand there, but to really expand people's imagination around not only the deep social issues that, and water and sanitation and agri and childcare and the care economy more broadly, and training and education, but also the opportunity to back the innovators and the leaders that are there, so that this isn't about really, it is about helping the most marginalized, but it's also about backing the innovators who really have solutions in these areas and getting them the fuel to really solve the problems that they can solve. So I'm excited about the opportunity to think about this in the context of supply chains, for people to also expand their view around what could this look like if you really incorporate gender-based violence or access to reproductive health as a condition as an area of impact to really be exploring. And as we've been talking in the project, the need for standards and transparency. This is a moment, again, where we didn't have standards in so many other areas of investment. And people said, well, you could never have a standard about that. And now you think about the work of the pioneers in carbon financing. We have standards, which we didn't have. So I think that's absolutely essential. So I want to provoke a few questions to the group here, but also for the audience. And one of them is, do people agree that some level of standardization is valuable? And who would be the best placed to really work on that? We have the 2X standards, which are emerging, an incredible collaboration with the GIN and the IRIS metrics, with IFC, with the Impact Management Project. There's a lot of good collaboration happening already. So the standards, and of course the ICMA is the holder of the standards around green bonds. Is that the right place for a standard around this? And how do we get this community that has so much knowledge now of more than 10 years of doing gender lens investing to really participate, so that this is really good, as has just been the process around the 2X standards and the IRIS Plus metrics. The second is, where does this community see the opportunity, the first opportunity for the first gender bonds to really take hold, and where? And what do you think are the biggest roadblocks from your perspective? We've outlined, you know, this report outlines a lot of the roadblocks and the opportunities, but it would be great to hear a little bit more. And then what do you think it would help in the field in the African context to move this forward? So these are just a few things that are on my mind. And if you've got something you want to share, unmute yourself, but I'd also like to put it out to our group of panelists. I also want to say one last thing. It's been a great thing to have the expertise of somebody like Dr. Rebecca Calder, who comes from the social development side, together with Lions Head Global Partners, together with FSD Africa, UN Women, Ani Patton, who's been working on innovative finance. I mean, it's just this constellation of people. Criterion Institute that's doing so much work around gender lens investing, and this question around gender-based violence and seeing risk. So again, it's going to take that level of talent and expertise to do this, but I know that we have it here.
Thanks, Suzanne. And so we've got about 10 minutes or so for discussion. I'm not sure if you can raise your hands or you can unmute yourself. So I've just mentioned in the chat, if you want to say something, just put your name in there and we'll unmute you. In the meantime, Gaia, I don't know if you wanted to say anything in response to any of Suzanne's questions, or Evan's. Or Anita, I didn't realize you were still here.
Don't forget to put yourself back on video so that we can see you.
Yeah.
Evans, I don't know if do you want to, I know you had a couple of thoughts, but otherwise I'm very happy to.
Evans, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're okay.
Sorry, please proceed, Juliet.
Okay, no, Gaia, why don't you kick off?
Sure. So, so I actually, there's on the emerging market side, I think it's really important that we think about this really carefully and look at all of the aspects of where women are impacted. So it is, it's really women across the board, right? And it's the SME owners, so through the microfinance side of things, but it's also women working in large manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So I don't, I think we do need clarity on what within that qualifies. And as we said at the beginning, I'm absolutely not a gender expert. So I've done a lot of learning from everyone that participated in the study, but having a standard that is able to guide people in understanding, okay, well, I'm doing this activity. I think if I change it a bit to actually take into account this broader perspective, then perhaps this is something I can participate in. I think that's really, really important. So having, and whether how this works and how this emerges potentially from this conversation is to be determined. But what I would personally love to see is participants from emerging markets and from developed markets getting together and deciding, okay, well, these are the things that are important. And I think one way that this is really obvious, at least to me, in the gender bonds that have been issued today, is how they are sort of two extremes of that spectrum, right? And so for anyone looking at those two sets of bonds, you could say, well, are you using the same criteria to think about these, right? And the reality is that, yes, people are roughly referencing similar things, so that's fine, but can we formalize that so we can get more people to participate? Because if you don't know what something is, it's impossible for you to be interested in it. And so from my perspective, it's, you know, the question around how do we develop this in emerging markets. Now, from our experience in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a strong willingness there. There's been, everybody we spoke to was interested. People are interested in this. They want to understand how to include it, how to participate. But there needs to be greater clarity around what that participation requires. And so, as I said, you know, you can open these markets with something that is relatively vanilla. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you can go to something that's really exotic and structured and cool, then that's wonderful as well. But sort of, I don't think there's anything wrong with sort of starting with the vanilla side and getting people comfortable and bought into what this means, and then evolving from there. And that's very much how the green and broader social space has evolved over time.
There's the raise hand function does work. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, then they can do so. There's a few questions coming through, and I wonder if we should pick up on a couple of those. Andia, I liked your question about whether it would make it less risky if we were looking at this from a Pan-African perspective and not necessarily from a country perspective. And I wonder if that's something that one of our panelists would like to pick up. There was also a question from Jennifer earlier about the fact that these different types of bonds are emerging over time. As you mentioned, Gaia, green bonds are coming to the market. Blue bonds is now a new form of bond. And I wonder if there's any opportunity to build economies of scale, is the question Jennifer's asking, around education on bonds, different types of bonds, as we enter this sort of expansion world. So I don't know if you want to answer those questions. There was also a question from, I think, Patricia, asking about the fact that we're talking about gender bonds. Does that mean we're talking about women? Which is a good point of clarification. So perhaps we could answer some of those questions.
Just very quickly, I'll take the question from Jennifer on the economies of scale. I think a lot of work has been done by market participants in creating things like the green bond and the social bond principles, which have proven very effective in guiding specifically issuers in what is required to issue a bond that is then labeled as this. And what the other side of it is that also there's this encouragement to use a second party opinion provider. So getting some sort of third party assurance that actually, yes, what you're doing is aligned with the greater spirit and method. So I would say that using some of this existing infrastructure to build on the standards, absolutely, it is, I mean, makes a lot of sense to me. And also on all of the work that's, and Suzanne mentioned this, that's already gone into looking at criteria for gender lens investing broadly, and impact investing. So absolutely, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, but there are questions there that are not trivial about what is eligible and what isn't. And so I think that's necessary. And in terms of, there's a second aspect to economies of scale, which is, can you aggregate small uses of proceeds into a bigger issuance? And somebody, and I'm so sorry, somebody asked about whether in West Africa you could do this by aggregate because there's a common currency. Could you do one bond that aggregates different uses of different activities that are being financed across the region? And the answer is absolutely. It's all about once you get into those structuring questions, it's about, is the risk profile of this issuance something that investors are comfortable with, right? So if it's lending to a lot of smaller institutions that maybe on their own aren't creditworthy to go and list a bond, then do you need some sort of junior capital in that structure? Do you need a guarantee from somebody? Maybe not. It depends on the investor appetite as well. So it is always a conversation between those who have the pipeline and the issuance side and the investors who will say, actually, we do want exposure to these gender positive activities, but we're not comfortable with taking this type of risk yet. We want something more vanilla, or otherwise they may say, let's go for it. Let's do a securitization. But it's a conversation on both sides.
Yeah, Juliet, can I just add a few words as well? One, I think to echo what Guy has said about standards. If you're going to establish gender bonds and as a unique asset class, you need to standardize so that everybody, the issuers, the investors, they understand, the regulators understand, because there will be investor protection considerations around that, especially around the disclosures. So that's very important to establish this as an asset class. The second thing I wanted to say is in terms of getting scale, we need to think about issuers going beyond the financial sector, also looking at the corporate. And I think the bigger cake for me, I think the bigger thing to go for is also around the sovereign gender bonds, if you can develop the standards to allow for that. Because sovereigns are already issuing huge sums of money in the market in terms of raising huge sums of money in the market from bonds. And some of that money can actually go into gender lens investments that can provide basic services that benefit the communities that we're trying to, to support. So that could be one of them. And then of course, to create whatever empowerment opportunities that are needed for the sector as well. So that's what I could say on that. In terms of the issuers, should we have one Pan-African issuer or should we just be promoting individual issuers? I think it's an issue about sequencing in a sense, because at the moment we're starting with demonstration. We don't have a gender issue at the moment. So any issue that we get to them in the market that meets a very defined criteria is important in terms of providing that demonstration. So let's start somewhere and then we scale it up and provide, I don't know whether it's training or advocacy to basically build awareness around the emerging, asset class. And then of course, ultimately, what matters is the investors. Investors will be looking at this from two perspectives. One is the credit perspective. So they'll be looking at, will they get their money back? Will they get the interest back? That's a very important, the first consideration that the investors will be making. And then the second consideration, obviously, is to be able to do good. So where is the money going? What's the use of proceeds? So the gender bonds will have to meet those two criteria for them to be attractive to investors in the continent. And I think I must say that if you're looking at even pools of capital in the continent, within the continent, we're already looking at about $1 trillion of assets under management sitting between pension funds, insurance, or collective investment schemes, institutional investors generally. And those investors are looking for returns that, of course, meet their risk profile. But also many of them, especially in the COVID environment, what I've heard is that a lot of those investors are also looking to make investments that contribute to a greater good, helping Africa build back better.